Imagine yourself trying to communicate with someone who doesn't understand you, and it takes work and effort on both sides to connect. Imagine what that's like for those who are deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing. Hello, welcome to InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw, and this is a very special edition of InSight about Bridges, Oregon, a nonprofit created by deaf individuals serving deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing Oregonians. Bridges, Oregon advocacy, employment, independent living, and sign language and interpreting services are designed to build bridges. Not an easy task, as they point out on their website. There are too many barriers and not enough bridges. Why is that? Who are the people behind Bridges, Oregon? What are they doing that works to overcome communication barriers? And what do they think will truly facilitate equity and inclusiveness for those who seek their help? With me today is Chad Ludwig, the founder and executive director of Bridges, Oregon, who will talk to us through interpreters, our interpreters, using sign language. Welcome, Chad. So nice to have you on InSight.
Thank you, Wendy. It's an honor to be here with you today.
As we start, I'd love to know, give us an update on your most recent program, the one that's a hotline 24/7, and anything else that's going on.
Yes, we just got a 24/7 hotline up and running where we provide accessible services to deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing Oregonians who have experienced domestic violence, where they need a safe way to connect with professional staff who are well trained, and where they can have accessible communication without having to depend on a third party like an interpreter, either in person or by video. They can have that direct conversation with the professional. So we have a team that's ready to respond as needed and provide those services at any time during the day. And we've also been awarded a few grants that we'll be receiving and starting later in this year, where we can expand our services as well.
What was the idea behind this service? How did it get going? What need was there?
It very much started because we had a community-based needs assessment where we asked the Oregon legislature in 2015 for some funding that we received so that we could do some research and collect data across the state. After that study was completed, it was published and presented back to the legislature in 2017. It was over a 100-page report with over 800 data collections from the community in the state. And the legislature at that time said they didn't have funding to respond to the report that we had and the needs that we saw. So we collected the data, but nothing was getting done with that. So I decided to run with it and open up this nonprofit to try to meet the needs and fill in the gaps in services that there were around the state.
So when did Bridges, Oregon start? When was it officially up and running?
We were founded the day after the Oregon legislature closed their 2017 session. So July 5th, 2017, almost 8 years ago.
You've been bringing down barriers for a long time now. What is your history?
Well, first I was born deaf. And I'm deaf because I have something called Pendred syndrome, which was a genetic thing that predetermined that I would be deaf. My family decided to raise me in a signing environment. And, through a lifelong journey of just having barriers to getting information, I should back up and say that I'm a native of California. And California has several centers for the deaf throughout the state. So I was familiar with that model of services being provided. And then I was living in New York for a time, and my mother was living with me. She started experiencing early onset dementia. And wanted me to move to Oregon to be with her. So after moving out to Oregon and getting settled in, I looked around at the landscape and was taken aback by how little there was in the state. I just was shocked that people just sat there and took it, and I wasn't going to. So that's where I started getting going, and it's been a great journey ever since.
You've made a number of trips to the legislature, am I correct? To try to talk to them about the need and what could be done?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm a frequent visitor at the Oregon legislature, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming session this coming year. I'm going to continue doing advocacy work and going to the legislature with the intent. The reason I picked the office that we're at, we're just a few blocks away from the legislature, so just 2 or 3 blocks away from the state capitol building. And I wanted to be that close so that we increased our visibility, so that we could go down to the legislature, legislators could come down and visit us.
And have they individually perhaps come down and visited you out of curiosity?
Yeah, I think we've had three or four. I know 3 for sure, maybe 4 legislators, senators and representatives have come by our offices, yeah, for a visit. And they're just as excited as we are that we're up and running, that we have the resource available to the community, that we're serving a unique and marginalized population.
Do you have any statistics on how many deaf, blind, and hard of hearing there are in Oregon?
Yes, when you look at statistics that are published by the Center for Disease Control, CDC numbers say that about 1 out of 4 Americans have some form of hearing loss. And that's the whole gamut, the whole range from just turning up the TV a little louder to being profoundly deaf. So since Oregon has 4.2 million people living in the state, we're looking at something like over 1 million Oregonians who have some kind of hearing loss in the state. And then there's some other formulas that we can get from Gallaudet University and other institutes where we figure there are over 4,000 signers, so deaf people who depend on American Sign Language in the state. And then another study shows that half of that 4,000 are deaf individuals who live with other disabilities. So they're deaf and they experience other barriers due to other disabilities. And then the last statistic comes from the Helen Keller National Center, where they report there are about 350 deaf-blind Oregonians. And then, actually, the last statistic, Oregon Early Hearing Detection Center says that there are 100 babies born who have hearing loss in the state every year.
Thank you for that. You say you are, and I'm reading from your website, by, of, with, and for deaf. What do you mean by that?
Sure, that's a great question. So by, meaning the Bridges team, we built bridges together, work together. Of, it meaning belonging. With means that we're all in this together to address discrepancies, injustices. And then for means that we have a space that we offer to the community of deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing individuals, and other individuals who have hearing loss.
What services do you offer? There are a number listed.
Yes, there are. So yes, we do have quite a few services. And the first service that we had 4 years ago when we got going roughly, advocacy for domestic violence survivors. So people who have experienced domestic violence, violence in dating relationships, and other violent victims of violence, arson, theft, so crime. Victims of crime advocacy was the first grant that we got. So the Oregon Judicial Department reports that American Sign Language is the most often used sign language, the second most common language in the courts after Spanish, as far as languages that need accommodated. So we have members in our community who are in the judicial system and need support and are facing barriers in the judicial system. So providing advocacy for that. Then we also provide independent living and employment resources, so helping people develop their resumes and look for work, helping people figure out what accommodations are needed on the job. And then we also assist deaf people who have developmental disabilities, who need extra support on the job to be successful at work in their place of work. We also have interpreting services that we provide. We do sign language proficiency assessments, so a service where people who sign can figure out where they're at in the journey to becoming fluent and proficient. We also have a few upcoming programs that we were looking forward to. One called a Co-Navigator program, where we send an employee to work with a person who is deafblind, where they go out together to, say, the grocery store or to different events in the community, or just different places that the deafblind individual would like to go to, so that they're not isolated and stuck at home. And with that support, they can be more independent and more autonomous as they go out into the community. And that's a great service for them. We also do case management services, which is another form of advocacy, not for just domestic violence and sexual assault, but then with case management, we can provide just general services where deaf, blind, and hard of hearing person might be facing barriers in terms of if they're incarcerated in jail or in prison, if they're facing barriers in medical settings at the doctor or the dentist. We get a lot of calls from the community where they ask for accommodations, they ask for access to certain places, and they're denied. And they might need accommodation, like if somebody's hard of hearing and they're in a noisy environment, they may just need to go to a different room that's quieter so that they can hear. And often that simple kind of accommodation that they request is denied because the provider doesn't understand the need. So for medical appointments, doctors often try to use language line, video services, an interpreter on a TV, but there are problems inherent with that. The connection might not be good enough to support the video, or there might be disconnected, but the provider only wants to use that accommodation. That kind of accommodation would be analogous to if you're on the phone line and the connection's so bad you can't hear the person and you end up just hanging up. But that's the only accommodation that certain providers are willing to provide when there are those video issues. They're not willing to provide an in-person interpreter. So different barriers like that, the community is frustrated and worn out. So Bridges Oregon is a space where we can provide advocacy, we can help them get through those barriers, remove those barriers that they're experiencing, help them get the accommodations they need so that they can carry on with their lives.
Is this a possibility that you might be able to get a grant to help out with this on your end, providing improved services in the areas the community desperately asks for them?
Yeah, we have multiple grants that we've been awarded already. We're on our 4th fiscal year cycle, operating. We're operating in our 4th fiscal year, and we're operating with a $4 million budget right now. Currently, we have a team of 14 on staff, and we might be adding as many as 12 more before the end of the year. So yeah, we're moving and growing, and it's a busy time for us. And yeah, we've received grants from several different state agencies, from federal agencies. There are foundations that have donated to our cause. We also receive private donations.
How do you gauge success?
The deaf community is a close-knit community, and I think success to us is just word of mouth and all the good things that are being spoken about, hearing about just the different way things are being done, the different way business is being done now, that barriers are being removed, addressed and removed, and that they're safe. So yeah, I think things are really on the move for people who are deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing.
What makes Bridges, Oregon so unique, really different?
Well, as it stands now, Bridges is the only culturally linguistic accommodating service agency in Oregon for the deaf and deafblind and hard of hearing. And we're the only ones who can provide these kinds of services. Often, so for example, if there's a survivor of domestic violence, I've heard many stories in the past of survivors who, say, leave their home environment because it's not safe, and they go to a shelter that's designed for hearing people, and the shelter doesn't know what to do with them, doesn't know how to support them, doesn't know how to make it an accessible and welcoming place to the person who's deaf or deafblind, doesn't know how to deal with interpreters, or maybe they're willing to use interpreters but don't have the budget for interpreters. And so I've heard many stories of deaf women going back to homes that are not safe because they try to leave, they see all the barriers that there are to leaving, and it in their minds and in the calculus, it's just easier to go back to that abusive relationship. So we're partnering with 52 different sister agencies around the state where we can provide training, we can provide cultural awareness, we can provide a place of healing for deaf people who are experiencing these things. So we're partnering with agencies to make this happen. And we're able to do this because of the funds that are available that support us.
What impact are you having?
Well, with the domestic violence services advocacy that we're providing, I remember before we wrote the first grant, I talked to different sister agencies throughout the state and asked, how many deaf people are on your caseload? How many people are you encountering? And many of those agencies said they didn't see any deaf people. And the first year after we were in operation, with the services that we were providing, they were talking to those agencies again. They said there were over 50 survivors that they were working with, and now that I've heard the count's up to 120. So, I mean, more and more stories like that are coming in all the time.
You have lobbied the Oregon State Legislature for years to fund much-needed community projects for deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing, and those with additional disabilities. What's taking so long?
Looking back to 2015, I think the challenge there was with the legislature, they just didn't get it. This was new to them, and they didn't understand the scope of the problem. So they wanted data back then. And often, deaf and hard of hearing people are just overlooked. They're not included in data collection out there.
Excuse me.
When it comes to service.
May I interrupt? Not included in data collection?
Right. So where I was going with that was that in general practice, you might have one line on a survey that says disability. And that's kind of where the data is tracked, where deaf and hard of hearing people are tracked. So they get lumped in with all sorts of different kinds of disabilities. So the data is not granular enough to know what actually is needed for them. So often deaf and hard of hearing people really become an invisible group, an invisible disabilities. So they're not recognized in the broader culture. So we're here to get the word out, to work on making sure that we're not counted as just one more disability group, but we're counted as deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind. Because we don't consider ourselves as people with disabilities. You know, you and I are here in this room having this conversation, and you know, we look basically the same. The only thing that separates us is language, right? Language is the only thing that separates us. Yeah, I've got a degree. My husband has a master's degree. You know, highly educated, running a nonprofit. It's just that the language that we use becomes a barrier because the systems out there don't understand the needs, our needs, and the language we use.
What do you think would go the longest way toward fixing that? People who need to understand and get it.
It might take several generations, really, to break down all the barriers that are out there, to get through all the ignorance. What I would love to have is more funding. I mean, then we'd be able to get out there more, do more outreach, do more public education, do more training, and work with people to improve the policies that they have and the resources that they provide so that they understand better how to make their spaces a positive place for deaf people, deafblind, hard of hearing. You know, our employment team faces a lot of challenges, which I've been hearing about recently even. You know, a story of one meeting with an HR manager where the HR manager came to me and said, you know, I was blown back by your presentation because I can think of times when I got applications from a deaf person and I saw that they were deaf and I threw their resume away because that person just didn't know what to do with an applicant who was deaf. Didn't know how to hire them, didn't know how to provide accommodations, go through the whole process. It was easier just to pass. And so, you know, I had this HR person admitting this to me. So our community is constantly talking about how hard it is to find a job. You know, there are a lot of deaf people out there who want to work but have an incredibly hard time getting hired because the hiring folks don't understand. So we're there to help people understand and have those aha moments so that they'll hire qualified deafblind and hard of hearing people to work.
I would think that some of the chief candidates of employers would be those who are in law enforcement, medicine, situations where the need is great and immediate for someone who could be there to assist in bridging gaps with people who have disabilities like deafness, deafblind, and hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of in line with that, I go to the Department of Public Safety Standards and Safety Training, and I teach a class there at the Law Enforcement Academy once a month. And I've been doing that for about 5 years now. I've probably trained over 3,000 officers, you know, who were cadets at that time. And that's a commitment that I value a lot because, you know, just every class is different. And I always get great questions from the cadets that shows how critical the need is. And so, you know, I've been doing that in the law enforcement arena. Now I'm looking at healthcare. I'll be looking at the fire departments as well eventually. So just going from area to area as needed when we have the funding. You know, making a space where we can go out in the community and fill all those gaps.
Do you have some stories to tell us where you've made a big difference with some way?
There's so many to choose from, really. One that comes to mind that really touched me. There's one individual who is homeless, a deaf woman. She'd been on the street for 5 years. She was on waiting lists. She was trying to receive services and support. Often she'd go around to homeless shelters or different organizations that served the houseless community looking for housing. And not one of those appointments provided any kind of accommodation. Not one in her experience. And then one day she found out about us through some networking. Reached out to us immediately. And we were able to support her, help her, and get her in permanent, stable housing. To get her, benefits with Social Security and everything hooked up. And, she's doing great. She's got permanent, stable housing now. She's safe. And, yeah, it's just amazing the transformation that I've seen in her life because she's off the street.
Would that not also make a difference to the people who actually saw that she could do that and agreed to be of assistance? I can imagine the communication made a difference to them as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
How do people get in touch with you about your services, and where do they connect with you?
Sure. We're located in downtown Salem. We are a statewide service provider, though, so anybody in the state, anywhere, can reach out to us. We have some grants that limit our reach to certain geographic regions, so depending on the service, depending on the grant that we're able to fund the services from, we might be limited. But people can call us. They can send an email. They can contact us by text, fax, or just come by our office.
And your website?
Yes, our website is bridgesoregon.org.
Easy enough to understand. Just right now, we've been talking, and it made me feel really comfortable to be able to get how it's done. And it's so easy to do once you understand it. Your interpreters have been wonderful. This has been a really wonderful experience. Chad, thank you so much for being my guest today on InSight. I hope our paths cross again.
I look forward to that. Yeah, I'll give you some updates. I'd be happy to give you updates on how we're doing. Thank you for inviting me.
Please do. I'm eager to hear it. So much happening. Well, thank you for joining me today on InSight, and thank you for joining us today on InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw.